Oliver, so this has to be considered a incredible political event for Boris Johnson to exit the scene. Why?
Well, I think it's incredible in a number of ways. The first is the kind of in a short-term sense, right? So we had this kind of really unprecedented number of cabinet and ministerial resignations over the course of 48 hours, 72 hours that, many other prime ministers would have realized the game was up a lot sooner and kind of spared themselves the indignity of having to have all these further resignations. So it was kind of extraordinary in the way that Boris was kind of clinging on towards the end. But also extraordinary in a broader sense when it comes to Boris Johnson's dramatic kind of turnaround in political fortunes. So, he won a massive majority only in 2019, not that long ago. It was the biggest Conservative majority in the House of Commons since Margaret Thatcher. He delivered Brexit. He was riding high. He had a huge mandate to, under the British system, if you have a big majority in the Commons, you can do whatever you want. He was kind of, seemed unstoppable. Seemed just a sort of supernatural political force that couldn't be tamed. And then a couple of years later, here we are.
It's very bizarre from the American perspective. And I have, in terms of my writing about Boris over the years, compared him quite frequently to Newt Gingrich as opposed to Donald Trump, meaning that he's someone who is an intellectual on a certain level. He's sort of weirdly connected to a lot of different intellectual threads. He doesn't have that kind of outsider celebrity status, though he does, obviously, have some aspects of that. But one of the things that happened to Newt is that a coup kind of snuck up on him. It took him out of his normal element. Is that what happened here?
Well, one of the things about Boris Johnson is that he is not a kind of party beast, right? He's never really enjoyed the sort of hanging out with MPs and the kind of FaceTime you need to have in the House of Commons and kind of the charm offensive and the kind of clubbability that successful prime ministers often have. And he's been sort of semi-detached from the Conservative Party and kind of ambivalent in terms of his relationship to it. And so I think for that reason, he always had this quite, Conservative MPs always had quite a transactional relationship with him. And as soon as he stopped delivering the goods, as soon as they got the sense that he was a liability rather than an asset, and it's unclear that that's actually correct, that he's a liability, by the way. But as soon as that was the sort of conventional wisdom, I think was when the game was up. In his resignation statement this morning, he said that it was kind of a little bit saltier than most prime ministerial resignation statements. And he said,
I noticed that.
and he said that he blamed, one of the things he blamed was the power of the herd, and this kind of herd mentality for bringing him down. And so, I think there's this sense with Boris that he kind of thinks that everyone's a chancer, everyone's basically lying, and everyone's kind of bluffing the whole time. He's better at it than everyone else. And they got him this time, but he's intensely competitive and sort of confident and doesn't want to feel as though he's lost, full stop, lost for good kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a path for him to come back?
Well, I mean, his great hero, Winston Churchill, obviously had his wilderness years, as did, I think, perhaps a more accurate historical analogy, Benjamin Disraeli. But that's very unusual in modern British politics. I think the first question is, what does he do next? Does he stay? And that really is, does he stay in Parliament or not? So if he chooses to keep his seat, which is not something that David Cameron did, for example, But if he chooses to keep his seat, he could choose to stay as a kind of leader in waiting, a kind of leader of a kind of faction. And, like I said, it's not clear. The next leader might come along, might fight an election, might lose that election, and Boris still feels like he's the biggest beast around. He still feels like he can beat anybody out there. He's better than anybody out there. And so if he goes down that path, I certainly don't think you should. It's certainly possible, but like he may just think, I'll step down, I'll write my books, I'll make some money with some advisory roles, but I don't know.
Explain to us, as Americans, why on earth he had to leave.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? Because certainly watching from Washington, I'm based in Washington. Sometimes the kind of substance of the rows which ultimately brought him down seemed quite small. So Partygate, which was the row over,
they seem not just small; they seem infinitesimal. They seem absurd in a certain way. The coup that brought Newt Gingrich down was mostly based off of a dispute over fiscal policy. Mm-hmm. And a number of other sort of decisions that had been made under the Republican leadership at the time. The coup that brought John Boehner down, in the Republican Party, here was mostly about his sort of refusal to bring a number of conservative pieces of legislation to the floor. So there were sort of, they seemed minor, but they were legitimate complaints. Mm-hmm. Is this sort of the same situation here, where it's minor in the big scheme of things, but also is kind of indicative of the direction that the leadership is going? So
I think there's two things. I think that the small stakes notwithstanding, Boris was consistently sort of dishonest. He was consistently seen to be quite bad at putting together a coherent kind of response, quite bad at getting a grip on these things. And we had the most recent thing, which was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, was this row over sexual harassment allegations for a deputy chief whip. So a reasonably significant kind of political ally of his. And he basically said he didn't know anything about this.
And what was that? Explain it just to our audience.
There was just a number of different allegations of inappropriate behavior.
His name is Pecker, right? Or something like that. What?
Pincher, which is a good name for an MP accused of groping people without their consent.
Yes.
But basically, Boris had said he didn't know anything about this before he appointed him, and then that was later shown to be not true. But the second part of this is, if you think of these scandals as the kind of cost side of the ledger, where if you're a Conservative MP, like, these are the things I have to put up with if Boris is going to stay. The problem was he didn't give them anything on the other side of the ledger. He didn't say, here I am, we have a big conservative majority, here are the things we've always wanted to do. Let's cut taxes, let's deregulate housing, mm-hmm. so we can make the cost of living lower, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't do any of those things, and he sort of tinkered around, and he was unfocused. And when he did do stuff, often he did stuff that he veered to the left, not to the right, and he increased taxes, which was breaking a promise there again. And so I think, as much as anything else,
that sort of leads me to the next question, which is to say, is the issue with Boris actually that he was not a conservative leader?
I think so. He's got funny and difficult to kind of characterize, ideological views, and I think on some of the economics, he certainly kind of veered leftwards. And if you look at their response to the pandemic and everything, the size of the state increased a lot. He did fight quite vociferously. I mean, more more vociferously than many in his party would have liked on lots of the cultural stuff, on lots of the kind of, and he had this quite compelling account of a post-Brexit Britain that had to look at itself, look at its elite, look at its establishment, and say, they're not up to the job, and we need, this isn't working in a actually quite Trumpian way, I would say, even though that analogy is overdone. That aspect of it, I think there was something to. But then I think by the end, he just looked like he was part of that problem rather than the solution to it.
Well, one of the things that frustrated me about Boris is that it seemed like he would sound these great notes on the culture war sort of elements of what he was experiencing. And then when it came to actual policy, he would veer in the other direction. Mm-hmm. Is that an unfair criticism, or is that accurate?
That's not. I don't think that's unfair. But I just think the problem with this kind of debate is we're applying too much. We're assuming too much, like rhyme and reason, to Boris Johnson's time as prime minister, and that a lot of this was just like the last person who spoke to him, the advisor who wrote that specific speech, and it was just kind of a mess. And the case for Boris was always this. There was this idea that he would be like a front man, and he'd be a great performer, and he could be persuasive and make the case for whatever the government was doing, and that he needed behind him would need to be a kind of savvy and effective team, and that is not what we got.
So what comes next?
Well, so just in terms of the logistics, there's basically a Conservative leadership election. And the way that works is...
they all seem like a bunch of toffs.
Well, I don't know. It's an interesting group. But the way it works is basically that there's a contest amongst MPs, and then the MPs get it down to the final two, and then those final two goes to the members of the Conservative Party, and then they vote. And unlike previous races, like the one that Boris won, it's going to be a very crowded field. It's going to be a very unpredictable contest. There is not, I don't think there's one or two clear front runners. It's good. And so that'll take still about the fall. And there's some debate now about whether Boris will probably stay on as a kind of caretaker prime minister. But yeah, it's an unpredictable now situation.
Here's what I predict will happen, and I want you to tell me why I'm wrong. I feel like they will replace him with someone who's terrible. That terrible person will then bear the weight of the terrible policies that they put in place. There will be a complete cascade around that person, and that then there will be a reconsideration of Boris as opposed to a, ridiculous leftist conspiracy on the other side, and that he will have a path back. That's what I think.
Well,
and
maybe
I'm
it's
wrong,
certainly
tell me why.
It's certainly possible. You might be wrong just because Boris doesn't want to do it, but you might be wrong because the next, it would also be quite a long path, because the way it would work logistically is the next leader would probably have to lose an election. So then you have a Labour prime minister.
Yes.
And then you wait 5 years or 4 years or whatever. But we'll see. I mean, I think that whoever gets the job, Britain's in a really difficult position at the moment. Coming out of the pandemic, and post-Brexit, Britain hasn't really grown as an economy in a kind of per capita sense for like more than a decade now. Productivity is flatlining. There's a real kind of sense that things aren't working there. And so, this does come at like a very, very important moment for Britain, I think.
Why is Britain so weak at this moment? I mean, it just feels like a weak nation in terms of what you're trying to depict here. Yeah,
I think a couple of things. I think so. Brexit. I mean, who you ask, whoever you obviously get a million different answers to that question, but I think even if you're pro-Brexit, and I say that's
let me take a step back.
Yeah.
I'm someone who's obviously a fan of Brexit.
Mm-hmm.
I was entirely in favor of it. I was convinced by Daniel Hannan's argument in front of a number of different bodies as it relates to Brexit. But I also didn't necessarily think it would be great when it came to the economy of Britain.
Mm-hmm.
I thought in the short term there would be a lot of pain. But I did think that in the long term it would be better. And something that would be beneficial to the country. That's one of the reasons I was convinced by it. But I think that there are people now who basically want to pull the plug on it.
Well, so I would say, and I say this as someone who voted for Brexit, so this is not, the economic case for Brexit always, I think, acknowledged or should have acknowledged that there was an economic downside to leaving, but that you could more than make up for that if you used your freedoms outside of the EU to, reconfigure the British economy, rethink how we did things, and so on and so forth. The criticism.
Why are you beholden to these Italian tomato farmers?
Right, exactly. But the problem is we've kind of gone for a kind of fairly full-throated version of Brexit in terms of our relationship with the EU. And this would be one of the better criticisms of Boris, but we haven't actually done very much with our newfound freedom, right? So we sort of are in the worst of both worlds. That being said, it's not just a Brexit problem. So basically, post-financial crisis, Britain's had this chronic productivity issue, chronic, very anemic, very, very low growth. And so there are also deeper questions about the British economy. Outside of London, it's very centralized, the British economy. Outside of London, some very poor parts of the country are up there with the poorest parts of Europe. And that was Boris Johnson wanted to do something about that. He had this what was called a leveling up agenda, where he was going to, spread economic power around the country. But like many things with him, it sounded good, but there wasn't much evidence that it was actually happening.
One of the things that I think is so frustrating about this is that we are living through a time in which the West seems so weak in terms of leadership. And Boris, whatever you can say about him, seemed like a strong figure when it came to charting the path for the West. What is going to come next? Is Britain basically going to become an entity that is weaker when it comes to charting the path for the West and declaring where we are going to go because of Boris's leaving the stage?
I think I don't think so, because I think that he was very on Ukraine, for example, to take most recent kind of current crisis preoccupying Europe. He took a real lead on that. He was the first European leader, I think, that went to got his photo with Zelensky first.
Look, I'm sorry. How can you not be moved?
No, it's a trivial thing. But what I would say is that the Conservative Party and like every contender in this race and so on, that's a consensus issue where they will all take a very firm view on that. And actually, Ben Wallace, who is the current Defense Secretary, and according to a poll today, is the front runner, to some people's surprise, in this race. He's had
Gove seems like terrible. Gove seems terrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, go ahead.
No, he's what I was going to say is he's really built his kind of political brand off the back of this crisis, really. And so I think whether it's Russia, whether it's China, this government has been very keen to do as much as it possibly can and to prove to the world that Britain, especially post-Brexit, is not kind of shrinking from the stage, but wants to be, this idea of global Britain, wants to be a big player, wants to facilitate, European and American and Asian cooperation and European cooperation. I guess my worry would be more, is Britain going to be kind of affluent and unstable enough to do that, rather than whether there's a will to do it. If that makes sense.
No, it does. Look, I think this is an interesting time for a lot of reasons. You have an incredibly weak American president. You have a situation where, his ability, foreign policy wise, to marshal the West in any way is really hindered. And so because of that, people like Boris have become, far more outsized figures in dictating the way that we would go. Do you believe, just as a final question, do you believe that there is a path forward for conservatism in Britain that would include, a lot of these elements without necessarily sort of, breaking away from the lessons of the past? Because it seems to me that, in Boris, you had someone who was very much devoted to taking lessons from the past about the application of power in the moment, and whether he did that successfully or not. This is a moment in which, you have people resigning over culture war issues and the like, who seem completely out of touch with the nature of the trajectory of American conservatism, Western conservatism, in any kind of healthy way. Do you think that there's something there? Do you think that there's going to be a replacement for Boris that would emphatically defend the lessons that we've taken from, rejecting the culture war issues of the West? Or do you think that this is a situation where basically, you're going to end up with someone who's basically just a fiscal conservative, but with all of the, downsides of someone who is accepting the culture war revelations of the left?
Was that after Brexit, he understood the ways in which the political system, the economy, kind of social elites in terms of some of this cultural stuff, had gotten dangerously out of whack with what ordinary people cared about, right? That was the
yes.
That was a sort of headline takeaway from Brexit. He understood that. He delivered on Brexit, but understood that it had to be more than that, and that that Britain as a country had to internalize that lesson, learn that lesson, correct that mistake. And I think that when he won that majority, the great promise was that here was a man, an old Etonian, Oxford-educated, paid-up member of the elite who understood that, and there was a way in which we would kind of but also in a kind of
treasure to his class,
advertisement to the British system, way. That it was self-correcting in a way that other systems maybe weren't self-correcting and were getting more angry and so on. And so I think that the challenge for the next leader, whoever that is, and I think most of the candidates will understand that the challenge is for that baton to be passed to them, and for them to realize that those to make good on that kind of promise that Boris ultimately failed to deliver on.